You have spent most of your life believing that what you see is what is real, that the world unfolds first and then you respond to it, that events happen outside of you and your thoughts come afterward as a reaction. But if you slow down for just a moment and look more carefully, not at the world, but at your own experience of it, you begin to notice something that feels almost unsettling in its simplicity. Because what you call reality is never experienced directly. It is always filtered, shaped, interpreted, and silently rewritten through the lens of your own mind before it ever reaches your awareness as something real. And the moment you truly see this, even slightly, something inside you shifts. Not dramatically, not loudly, but in a quiet way that begins to rearrange how you understand everything that has ever happened to you. I want you to imagine, not as a theory but as something you can feel right now, that your mind is not reacting to the world. It is projecting a version of it. That every situation, every person, every outcome you encounter is not appearing in a neutral form waiting for you to interpret it, but is already shaped by the meaning you have unconsciously assigned long before the moment arrives. And this is why two people can stand in the exact same place, hear the same words, experience the same event, and walk away with completely different realities. Because what they are responding to is not the event itself, but the reflection of their own internal state appearing back to them through the mirror of life. You have called this coincidence, personality, luck, circumstance, but none of those explanations ever fully satisfied you. Because somewhere deeper than your logical mind, you have always sensed that there is a pattern, something consistent, something that keeps repeating in ways that feel too precise to be random. And that pattern is not in the world. It is in you. It is in the way you think, the way you expect, the way you silently assume things will unfold, even when you tell yourself you are being realistic. Because what you call realism is often just a memory of past assumptions projected forward and mistaken for truth. Let me show you this in a way that you cannot easily ignore, not by explaining it, but by guiding your attention back to your own experience. Because if you look at your life honestly, you will begin to see that certain types of situations repeat, certain emotional patterns return, certain outcomes seem to follow you no matter where you go. And even when the details change, the essence remains strangely familiar, as if life is echoing something back to you, not once, but over and over again, until you finally recognize that what you are seeing is not the world imposing itself on you, but your own inner state expressing itself in different forms. You might resist this idea at first, because it seems to challenge everything you have been taught. It appears to place responsibility in a place you were never told to look. And more than that, it suggests that you are not simply a participant in reality, but a contributor to it. And that realization can feel uncomfortable, not because it is false, but because it is unfamiliar. And anything unfamiliar to the mind often feels threatening, even when it is quietly revealing a deeper kind of freedom. Think about a moment when you were absolutely certain that something would go wrong, not based on evidence, but on a feeling you could not quite explain. And then notice how often that outcome seemed to confirm itself, not because you caused it in a physical sense, but because your entire perception began organizing itself around that expectation. You noticed certain details, ignored others, interpreted neutral actions as negative, and gradually, without realizing it, you aligned your experience with what you had already accepted as true inside you, and the world simply followed the script you were holding. Not consciously, but consistently. Now consider the opposite. Moments when you felt calm, certain, aligned in a way that did not depend on external proof, and how things seemed to unfold with less resistance, as if the path in front of you was already prepared, as if opportunities appeared at the right time. People responded differently, and outcomes felt almost effortless. And you might have called this luck or timing. But what if it was something else entirely? What if it was the natural consequence of an internal state that was no longer contradicting the reality you desired, but quietly supporting it? This is where you begin to see the mirror more clearly, not as an abstract idea, but as a living principle operating in every moment of your life. Because the world does not show you what is objectively there. It shows you what you are prepared to see, what you are ready to believe, what you have already accepted as possible or impossible. And this is why change feels difficult when you try to force it externally, because you are attempting to alter the reflection without touching the source. You are adjusting the image while leaving the mirror unchanged. And no matter how much effort you apply, the reflection continues to reorganize itself back into alignment with the state you carry within you. You do not need to fix every situation in your life to change your reality. You do not need to control every variable or predict every outcome, because those are surface-level movements. And the surface is always responding to something deeper, something quieter, something you rarely pay attention to because it operates beneath your conscious awareness. And that is your assumption, your inner knowing, the silent statement of, "This is how things are for me," which you repeat not with words, but with feeling, with expectation, with the way you move through the world without questioning it. When you begin to shift that, even slightly, the mirror begins to change. Not instantly, not dramatically, but in subtle ways that are easy to overlook if you are not paying attention. Small differences in how people respond to you, slight adjustments in how situations unfold, unexpected openings where there were once obstacles. And if you remain consistent, if you stay with the new assumption long enough for it to stabilize, those small changes begin to compound, forming a different pattern, a new rhythm, a reality that feels unfamiliar at first, but gradually becomes your new normal. And this is the part most people miss, because they are waiting for the external world to prove that something has changed before they allow themselves to believe it. But the mirror does not work that way. It does not lead. It follows. It reflects what is already established within you. And if you wait for evidence before you shift your state, you remain trapped in a loop where the old reality keeps confirming itself, not because it is fixed, but because you have not yet chosen to see beyond it. So I am not asking you to change the world. I am not asking you to deny what you see or pretend that circumstances do not exist. I am asking you to look at the one place where everything begins, the one place you have been taught to overlook, the quiet center of your own awareness, where every assumption is formed, where every expectation takes root, where every version of reality is selected long before it appears in physical form, and to realize that the mirror has never been outside of you. It has always been here, reflecting back to you not what is, but what you believe is. You may still be looking at your life as a collection of separate events, separate problems, separate outcomes that appear and disappear without any deeper connection. But if you stay with me for a moment and allow your attention to move inward instead of outward, you will begin to notice that beneath everything you experience, there is something far more consistent than circumstances, far more stable than situations, something that does not change nearly as often as the events you react to. And that is your sense of who you are, the quiet identity you carry within you, not the one you describe to others, but the one you assume to be true without ever needing to say it out loud. You might think your life is shaped by your actions, your decisions, your environment, but what you have not fully seen yet is that all of those things are simply extensions of something deeper, something that operates like a hidden thread running through every moment of your existence, weaving together your experiences in ways that feel natural, almost inevitable. And that thread is your core belief about yourself. The silent statement of, "This is who I am," which you repeat not with words, but with feeling, with expectation, with the way you interpret everything that happens to you. Imagine your life not as a series of disconnected moments, but as a fabric. And within that fabric there is one thread that determines the pattern of everything else. One thread that, if you were to change it, would not simply alter a small section of your life, but would begin to transform the entire design. And yet most people spend their lives trying to adjust the surface of the fabric, pulling at loose ends, patching over imperfections, without ever realizing that the pattern they are trying to fix is being continuously recreated by the thread they refuse to examine. I want you to look at your own experience again, but this time not at what is happening. Look at how it feels familiar, how certain outcomes seem to match an internal expectation you have carried for a long time, how certain roles repeat themselves, how you find yourself in situations that feel different on the surface but carry the same emotional tone underneath. And if you are honest, you will begin to see that this is not random. This is not coincidence. This is the expression of a belief that has been quietly guiding your perception and your choices long before the situation appeared. You may have never consciously chosen these beliefs. They may have formed through repetition, through past experiences, through things you were told, through moments that left an emotional imprint strong enough to be accepted as truth. But once they were accepted, they became part of your identity. And once something becomes part of your identity, it no longer feels like a belief. It feels like reality. It feels like something that simply is. And this is where the illusion becomes strongest. Because you stop questioning it, you stop noticing it, and you begin to live it out automatically, as if it were the only possible version of yourself. Let me bring this closer to you, because this is not abstract. This is happening in your life right now, in ways that are so subtle you might have overlooked them. The way you expect people to treat you, the way you assume opportunities will or will not come, the way you respond internally before anything even happens. All of these are not reactions. They are expressions of identity. They are confirmations of a belief that has already been accepted. And the world, as you experience it, aligns itself with that belief not because it is fixed, but because your perception organizes itself around what you have already decided is true. And this is why changing your life feels so difficult when you focus only on changing actions or circumstances, because you are attempting to produce a different result while holding on to the same identity. You are trying to rewrite the story without changing the character. And no matter how much effort you apply, the narrative continues to return to the same pattern, not because you are incapable of change, but because the thread that is weaving your reality has not been replaced. There is a moment, and you may have felt it before, when you briefly see yourself differently, not as who you have always been, but as someone else entirely, someone who moves differently, thinks differently, expects differently, and in that moment something inside you expands, as if you have stepped into a larger version of yourself. But then, almost immediately, you return to your old way of being, not because the new version was false, but because the old identity is more familiar, more practiced, more deeply rooted, and familiarity often feels more real than possibility. But what if that moment was not imagination? What if it was not a fantasy or a temporary illusion? What if it was a glimpse of a different thread you could choose to follow? A different identity that already exists as a possibility within you, waiting not to be created, but to be accepted. And what if the only reason it does not feel stable yet is because you have not remained with it long enough for it to become your new assumption, your new sense of self, your new I am? This is where everything begins to shift, not outside of you, but within the quiet structure of your own awareness. Because the moment you recognize that your identity is not fixed, that it is something you have been unconsciously repeating rather than consciously choosing, you begin to see that you are not bound to it, that you are not required to continue being the person you have always been simply because it feels familiar. And that realization, if you allow it to settle, carries a kind of freedom that is both subtle and profound. You do not change your life by forcing new outcomes. You change your life by becoming someone for whom those outcomes are natural, someone for whom those experiences are expected, someone whose internal statement of "this is who I am" already includes the reality you are trying to reach. And when that shift occurs, even slightly, your behavior changes without effort. Your perception reorganizes itself. Your reactions align differently. And gradually, almost quietly, your external world begins to reflect the new pattern you have established within. You may still feel the pull of your old identity. You may notice thoughts that try to return you to familiar patterns. And that is natural, because those patterns have been reinforced over time. But they are not permanent. They are not unchangeable. They are simply practiced. And anything that is practiced can be replaced with something new if you are willing to remain with it long enough for it to take root. Not as an idea, but as a felt sense of self, as a quiet certainty that does not need constant reinforcement because it has become your new normal. So instead of asking how to change what is happening in your life, begin to ask something deeper, something more fundamental. Begin to ask who you are being within it, what identity you are carrying into each moment, what thread you are using to weave your experience. Because once you see that clearly, once you recognize the connection between your sense of self and the pattern of your reality, you will no longer feel the need to chase change externally. You will understand that the source has always been within you, quietly shaping everything, waiting for you not to fix the fabric, but to choose a different thread. There is something happening inside you long before anything happens outside of you, and if you are not paying close attention, you will miss it completely, because it does not arrive as a loud declaration or a clear decision. It arrives as a quiet leaning, a subtle anticipation, a feeling that something will unfold in a certain way even before you have any visible reason to believe it. And that feeling, so easy to dismiss, so easy to overlook, is not passive. It is not neutral. It is already shaping the path ahead of you in ways that are far more precise than you have ever been taught to notice. You have been told that outcomes are determined by effort, by skill, by circumstance, by timing. But if you look more honestly at your own experience, you will begin to see that before any of those factors come into play, there is always an expectation already present within you, a quiet assumption about how things will go, and that expectation does not wait for evidence. It does not ask for permission. It simply settles into your awareness and begins organizing your perception, your behavior, your reactions, and even the way you interpret neutral events, aligning everything subtly but consistently toward confirming itself. Think about how often you have walked into a situation already knowing, without being able to explain why, whether it would go well or not, how you could feel success or failure before anything had actually happened, and how, more often than not, the outcome seemed to match that initial feeling, not perfectly, not always in obvious ways, but with a consistency that is difficult to ignore once you begin to see it. And what you may have called intuition, instinct, or simply a guess, was often something deeper, something more active, something that was not predicting the future, but quietly preparing it. I am not asking you to accept this as a belief. I am asking you to observe it within yourself, because the moment you see how expectation operates in your own experience, the way it shapes your attention, the way it filters what you notice and what you ignore, the way it influences your tone, your posture, your decisions, even the energy you bring into an interaction, you begin to understand that expectation is not something you carry after the fact. It is something you bring with you into every moment, and that presence is not passive. It is directive. You may still feel the impulse to argue that external reality is independent, that things happen regardless of what you expect, and on the surface, that appears to be true. But if you look deeper, you will begin to notice that your experience of what happens is never separate from the state you were in before it occurred, that two identical events can feel entirely different depending on what you anticipated, that the same words spoken by another person can be received as supportive or hostile based on what you expected to hear, and that over time, these interpretations accumulate, reinforcing the very expectation that shaped them in the first place. This is how a loop is created, not through force, not through control, but through repetition of a state that feels so natural you rarely question it. And once that loop stabilizes, it begins to appear as reality itself, something fixed, something external, something beyond your influence, when in truth, it is simply the reflection of an expectation that has been practiced long enough to feel like truth. And this is why change feels so difficult, because you are not just dealing with external conditions. You are dealing with an internal pattern that is continuously recreating those conditions in subtle ways. Let me bring you closer to this, because it is not abstract. It is happening in your life right now, in the way you approach conversations, in the way you anticipate responses, in the way you move through opportunities, even in the way you imagine your future when no one is watching. Because expectation is not limited to specific moments. It is a continuous state, a background assumption that colors everything you experience. And unless you become aware of it, it will continue to operate without your consent, shaping outcomes while you believe you are simply reacting to them. There is a difference between hoping and expecting, and you have felt it before even if you have never named it. Hope carries uncertainty. It leans forward but remains hesitant, while expectation carries a quiet certainty. Not loud, not forceful, but stable, grounded, as if the outcome has already been accepted internally. And it is this state, this quiet certainty, that has the greatest influence on what unfolds, not because it controls external events directly, but because it aligns your entire being with a specific direction, reducing resistance, organizing perception, and allowing reality to follow a path that matches the state you are holding. You do not need to manipulate the world to change your outcomes. You do not need to force situations into alignment, because the more you attempt to control externally, the more you reinforce the idea that the source of change is outside of you. And as long as you hold that belief, you will continue to chase results instead of shaping them. But when you begin to shift your expectation internally, when you allow yourself to feel a different outcome as if it were already natural, already familiar, something changes. Not instantly, not in a way that is always obvious, but in a subtle reorganization of how life responds to you. At first, it may feel like nothing is happening. You may still see the old patterns, the old responses, the old outcomes appearing in familiar ways. And this is where most people stop, because they are looking for immediate confirmation. They are waiting for the mirror to change before they commit to the new state. But expectation does not operate on that level. It requires stability, consistency, a willingness to remain with a new assumption even when the old reflection is still visible. And this is not about pretending or forcing belief. It is about gently but persistently returning your awareness to the state you choose to hold. You are not trying to convince yourself of something false. You are selecting a different version of reality to align with, a different pattern to bring into form. And that selection begins with expectation, not as a wish, not as a distant possibility, but as a quiet acceptance of what is already yours in the unseen. And when that acceptance becomes steady, when it no longer feels like effort but like a natural way of being, the outcomes you once struggled to create begin to appear with less resistance, not because they were impossible before, but because you were not aligned with them internally. So the question is not what you want to happen, and it is not even what you believe is possible. The question is what you are already expecting without realizing it. What quiet assumptions are guiding your perception? What outcomes you have accepted as inevitable? Because once you see that clearly, you will understand that your life is not being shaped by random events. It is being guided by an invisible architecture, one that you have been building continuously through expectation. And the moment you become aware of that, you are no longer a passive observer of what unfolds. You become the one who chooses the design. Underneath everything you consciously think you are choosing, something has already been chosen for you. And the reason it feels so natural, so unquestionable, is because it does not arrive as a decision in the moment. It arrives as something that has already been decided long before you notice it. Something that feels familiar rather than new. Something that quietly says this is just how things are. And by the time you become aware of it, you are no longer selecting a path. You are simply following a script that has already been written within you. You call it instinct, personality, to habit, sometimes even fate. But what you are actually experiencing is the echo of impressions that have been impressed upon your subconscious mind, repeated often enough, felt deeply enough, accepted silently enough that they no longer appear as beliefs. They appear as reality itself. And because they operate beneath your conscious awareness, they do not ask to be examined. They do not invite you to question them. They simply express themselves through your reactions, your expectations, your emotional responses, shaping your life while remaining largely invisible to you. Think about how quickly you react to certain situations, how immediate your internal response is before you have time to think logically about it. How a single tone of voice, a small change in someone's behavior, or even a memory can trigger a familiar emotional pattern within you. And notice how that reaction does not feel chosen. It feels automatic, as if something inside you has already interpreted the situation and delivered a conclusion before your conscious mind has even caught up. And that is not randomness. That is the subconscious operating from stored impressions that have been reinforced over time. You may not remember when those impressions were formed. You may not be able to trace them back to a specific moment, but they are there, quietly influencing how you see yourself, how you interpret others, how you expect the world to respond to you. And once they take root, they begin to act like a script, not a rigid one that controls every detail, but a flexible framework that guides the direction of your experience, shaping outcomes in ways that feel consistent even when circumstances appear to change. This is why you can find yourself repeating patterns you consciously want to escape, why you can understand something intellectually and still experience the opposite emotionally, why you can decide to change and yet feel pulled back into familiar reactions that seem to override your intention. Because the conscious mind may decide, but the subconscious mind executes, and whatever has been impressed deeply enough within it will continue to express itself until it is replaced. Not by force, not by resistance, but by a new impression that is felt with enough clarity and consistency to take its place. And here is where you begin to see something important, something that changes how you approach everything. Because if your subconscious is operating from impressions, then it is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is not something you are trapped inside of. It is something that has been shaped. And anything that has been shaped can be reshaped, but not in the way you have been taught, not through effort alone, not through repetition of empty words, but through the careful planting of new impressions that carry the same emotional weight, the same sense of reality, as the ones you are replacing. You do not rewrite a script by arguing with it. You rewrite it by introducing a new scene that feels more real than the old one, a new experience within your imagination that is accepted not as fantasy, but as something already true on a deeper level. And when that impression is felt strongly enough, when it is revisited consistently enough, when it begins to feel familiar rather than foreign, the subconscious starts to adopt it, not because it has been convinced logically, but because it has been impressed emotionally. This is why simply telling yourself something different rarely works, because the subconscious does not respond to what you say. It responds to what you feel to be true. And if your words are not aligned with your inner state, they pass through without leaving a mark. But when your inner state shifts, even slightly, when you begin to feel a new version of yourself as natural, as possible, as already in motion, that feeling becomes the seed of a new script, one that does not need to be forced into existence because it begins to express itself automatically through your perception and behavior. You might begin to notice small changes first, subtle differences in how you respond, moments where you react differently than you would have before, situations that feel slightly less charged, slightly more open, and it may seem insignificant at first, but those moments are not random. They are signs that a new impression is taking hold, that the script is beginning to shift, not all at once, but gradually, as the old patterns lose their intensity and the new ones become more familiar. It is important that you do not rush this process, that you do not demand immediate proof from the outside world, because the change begins within, in the quiet space where impressions are formed. And if you constantly look outward for confirmation, you may miss the subtle internal shift that is already underway. The moment where something that once felt certain no longer holds the same weight, the moment where a different possibility begins to feel just as real as the old limitation. And if you stay with that, if you allow the new impression to settle without forcing it, without doubting it simply because it is new, you begin to notice that your external reality starts to reflect that change. Not dramatically at first, but in ways that are unmistakable once you see the pattern, because the subconscious does not distinguish between what is imagined and what is experienced when the feeling is the same. And whatever it accepts as true, it will express outwardly through your life. So instead of trying to control every outcome, instead of reacting to every situation as if it were independent of you, begin to turn your attention inward, to the place where your reactions are born, to the impressions that have been guiding you without your awareness. And ask yourself not what is happening, but what has already been accepted within you that is allowing this to happen in the way it does. Because once you begin to see that clearly, you are no longer at the mercy of unconscious patterns. You become the one who can choose what is impressed, what is repeated, and ultimately, what is expressed. Something inside you has already decided how far things can go, how much is possible, how much is realistic, how much is too much. And it did not arrive as a conscious conclusion you sat down and carefully analyzed. It settled quietly over time, layer by layer, until it became a kind of internal boundary that you rarely question. And the reason it feels so solid is because it does not present itself as a belief. It feels like fact, like structure, like the invisible edge of what life can be for you. And once that edge is accepted, everything you experience begins to organize itself around it. You might think that the limits you encounter are coming from circumstances, from other people, from timing, from resources. But if you look closely at your own experience, you will begin to notice that long before those external conditions fully form, there is already a quiet certainty within you about how things will unfold. A subtle knowing that does not shout, does not argue, does not explain itself, but simply sits there, stable, unquestioned. And it is that certainty, not your effort, not your strategy, not even your desire, that carries the greatest weight in shaping what becomes real. You have felt this before, in moments when you just knew something would work out, not because you had all the answers, not because you could predict every step, but because there was a calm, grounded sense that it was already moving in your favor. And in those moments, you did not overthink, you did not hesitate. You moved naturally, you spoke differently, you acted without the same tension, and somehow, things aligned in ways that felt almost effortless. Not perfect, not always smooth, but guided, as if the path was already being supported by something you could not fully explain. And you have also felt the opposite, the moments when doubt quietly settles in, when uncertainty begins to creep into your awareness, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that subtly shifts how you carry yourself, how you interpret situations, how you respond to small signals, and before anything significant has even happened, you begin to feel the weight of something not working, something not aligning, and that feeling, if left unchecked, starts to shape your behavior, your perception, your decisions, gradually steering you toward the very outcome you were hoping to avoid. This is where you begin to understand that matter does not respond primarily to force. It responds to state, and among all the states you can hold, certainty is the one that carries the most influence, not because it is aggressive or dominant, but because it is stable. It does not fluctuate with every new piece of information. It does not collapse under pressure. It remains consistent even when the external world has not yet caught up. And that stability becomes the foundation upon which reality reorganizes itself. Certainty is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of contradiction within you. It is the moment when your thoughts, your emotions, your expectations, and your sense of self are no longer pulling in different directions, but are aligned around a single assumption, a single, "this is how it is." And when that alignment occurs, even briefly, something shifts, because you are no longer sending mixed signals into your experience. You are no longer reinforcing conflicting patterns. You are holding a clear, uninterrupted state that allows reality to follow without resistance. You may have been taught that you need to work harder, plan better, push more. But effort without alignment often creates friction. It amplifies the sense that something is missing, that something needs to be forced into place. And the more you push, the more you reinforce the idea that what you want is not naturally available to you, while certainty moves differently. It does not chase. It does not demand. It does not negotiate. It assumes, quietly and consistently, that what is held internally will find its way into form. This does not mean you stop acting. It means your actions are no longer driven by urgency or fear. They are expressions of a state that already accepts the outcome, and because of that, they carry a different quality, a different energy, one that is not trying to prove or secure something, but simply moving in alignment with what is already considered true. And that difference, subtle as it may seem, changes how others respond to you, how opportunities present themselves, how situations unfold over time. At first, this may feel unfamiliar, because you have been conditioned to rely on evidence before allowing yourself to feel certain. You have been taught to wait for proof, to confirm, to verify, to make sure, and while that may seem logical, it keeps you anchored to what already exists. It prevents you from stepping into a state that has not yet been reflected externally. And as long as you require evidence before you allow certainty, you remain confined to the boundaries of your current reality. The shift happens when you begin to allow certainty without immediate proof, not as blind belief, not as forced optimism, but as a quiet decision to hold a state that is not dependent on what you currently see. And this does not require you to ignore reality. It requires you to stop letting it define what is possible for you, to stop treating it as the final authority, and instead recognize it as a reflection that can change when the state behind it changes. You might notice resistance at first, thoughts that question, doubts that try to pull you back into familiar patterns, and that is natural. Because certainty, when it is new, does not feel stable yet. It feels like something you are choosing rather than something you are. But if you remain with it, if you return to it gently, consistently, without forcing it, it begins to settle. It begins to feel less like an effort and more like a natural way of being. And as that happens, the external world begins to shift in response, not instantly, but inevitably. What you are doing is not controlling matter directly. You are aligning with a state that matter responds to. And when that alignment is strong enough, when it is no longer interrupted by constant doubt or contradiction, it acts like a signal, a stable frequency that organizes the field around you, guiding events, interactions, and outcomes toward coherence with what you are holding within. And from the outside, it may appear as luck, as timing, as coincidence, but from within, you recognize it as something else, something you have always had access to but were never taught to use consciously. So instead of asking how to force results, begin to notice where your certainty truly lies, not in what you say you want, but in what you quietly accept as inevitable, because that is where your power is already active. That is where your influence is already shaping your experience. And the moment you become aware of that, the moment you begin to choose your certainty instead of inheriting it unconsciously, you step into a different way of creating, one that does not rely on struggle, but on alignment, one that does not bend reality through effort, but through the quiet, unwavering force of a state that no longer questions itself. Close your eyes for a moment, not to escape what is in front of you, but to notice something you have been using your entire life without ever being taught how powerful it actually is. Because the moment your attention turns inward, images begin to form, not randomly, not without structure, but in ways that feel familiar, almost automatic, as if your mind already knows how to construct entire experiences without needing permission from the outside world. And what you are touching in that moment is not fantasy. It is not idle daydreaming. It is the same mechanism that quietly directs the path your life takes long before anything becomes visible. You have been told that imagination is something separate from reality, something creative but not practical, something you use to escape rather than to build. And because of that, you have learned to treat it lightly, to engage with it casually, without realizing that every image you consistently return to, every scene you replay, every possibility you dwell on, is not staying inside your mind as a harmless thought. It is functioning as a direction, a signal, a subtle instruction that your perception and behavior begin to follow over time. Think about how often you imagine outcomes before they happen, how you run through conversations in your mind, how you anticipate scenarios, how you rehearse success or failure without even noticing that you are doing it. And then notice how those imagined moments often feel connected to what eventually unfolds, not in a rigid, one-to-one way, but in tone, in pattern, in emotional quality, as if your mind had already visited the place you later arrive at physically, as if the path had been quietly mapped out in advance. Imagination does not force reality into shape. It orients you within it. It acts like a compass that does not create the terrain, but determines the direction you move through it. And when that direction is clear, consistent, and aligned with a specific outcome, your attention begins to filter the world differently. You notice opportunities you would have ignored. You interpret situations in ways that support movement forward. And your actions, even when they seem spontaneous, begin to align with the direction you have already established internally. This is why two people with the same skills, the same resources, the same external conditions can experience completely different results, because one is moving with a clear internal image guiding their perception, while the other is drifting without a defined direction, reacting moment to moment without a consistent inner reference. And over time, that difference compounds, not because one is more capable, but because one is oriented while the other is not. You may think that what you imagine is influenced by reality, that you only picture what seems possible based on what you have seen before. But if you look more closely, you will begin to notice that imagination often reaches beyond your current circumstances, that it presents versions of yourself, versions of your life, that do not yet exist physically. And instead of dismissing those as unrealistic, consider that they are not predictions or fantasies, but possibilities that your awareness is already capable of accessing. Glimpses of directions you can choose to follow if you allow them to stabilize within you. The challenge is not in imagining something new. You have been doing that your entire life without realizing it. The challenge is in remaining with a chosen image long enough for it to become familiar, for it to move from something you occasionally visit to something you consistently return to. Because the mind does not distinguish strongly between what is vividly imagined and what is physically experienced when the emotional tone is similar. And whatever you revisit with enough consistency begins to feel real, begins to shape your expectations, begins to influence how you move through the world. This is where most people stop too early. They imagine briefly, they feel inspired for a moment, and then they return to their old patterns, their old images, their old assumptions, and the compass shifts back to its previous direction. Not because the new vision was impossible, but because it was not held long enough to establish a new orientation. And without that stability, your perception continues to align with what is most familiar rather than what is newly chosen. You do not need to force your imagination to be perfect. You do not need to visualize every detail with absolute clarity. What matters is the feeling of direction, the sense that you are already moving towards something that feels natural, that feels like it belongs to you. And when that feeling is present, even if the image itself is simple, it begins to guide your attention in ways that are subtle but powerful, shaping your decisions without the need for constant effort or analysis. There is a difference between imagining as an escape and imagining as a direction, and you have likely experienced both without separating them. Because when imagination is used as an escape, it feels disconnected from your life. It remains separate, almost like a temporary departure from reality. But when it is used as a direction, it begins to integrate. It influences how you see things, how you interpret situations, how you respond to opportunities. And gradually, the boundary between what you imagined and what you experience begins to blur. You may still feel doubt at times. You may question whether what you are imagining is realistic, whether it is possible, whether it can actually manifest in your life. And those thoughts are not something you need to fight. They are simply remnants of previous orientations, previous directions you have followed for a long time. And as you continue to return to a new image, a new direction, those doubts lose their intensity, not because you eliminate them, but because they are no longer supported by the state you are consistently holding. What you are doing is not creating something from nothing. You are selecting a path from a field of possibilities that already exists. And imagination is the tool that allows you to access and align with that path before it becomes visible. It is the bridge between what is currently experienced and what can be experienced. And the more consistently you use it with intention rather than passively, the more clearly it begins to guide you. So instead of asking what is possible based on your current reality, begin to notice what you are already imagining. What images you return to repeatedly. What scenarios feel natural to you? Because those are not random. They are directions you are already moving toward, whether you realize it or not. And once you become aware of that, you can begin to choose your direction consciously, not by forcing change externally, but by allowing your imagination to become the compass that quietly guides you into a different experience of reality. Pick up any object near you, something simple, something ordinary, and instead of naming it or thinking about what it is used for, just pause with it for a moment and notice how quickly your mind assigns meaning to it, how effortlessly it becomes something familiar, something defined, something fixed. And yet what you rarely question is that the object itself does not carry that meaning inherently. It receives it through your perception, through your attention, through the way your consciousness meets it. And the moment you begin to see this more clearly, something subtle shifts. Because what once appeared as a passive world of solid things begins to reveal itself as something more responsive, more impressionable than you were ever taught to consider. You have been trained to believe that matter is separate from you, that it exists independently, that it follows its own rules untouched by your inner state. And while there is a level at which that appears true, your direct experience tells a different story, one that becomes impossible to ignore once you pay attention, because the same place, the same object, the same situation can feel entirely different depending on the state you are in. And that difference is not coming from the object itself. It is coming from what you are bringing into the interaction, the subtle imprint of your consciousness shaping how that moment is experienced. Think about how a room can feel warm or cold, welcoming or tense, even before anything is said. How you can sense the emotional residue of a space without any visible indicator. How certain objects seem to carry a presence that goes beyond their physical form. And you may have dismissed this as imagination or sensitivity. But what you are actually perceiving is the imprint of consciousness that has been left within the environment, the accumulated impressions of thought, emotion, intention that have interacted with that space over time. This is not something mystical in the way you might have been taught to think of it. It is something you experience constantly without naming it. Because every time you touch something, every time you focus on something, every time you interact with your environment, you are not only perceiving it, you are influencing it. Not in a dramatic or immediate way that breaks physical laws, but in a subtle layering of meaning and association that becomes part of how that object or situation exists within your experience. You can see this clearly in your own life when you notice how certain objects hold memories, how a place can instantly bring you back to a specific feeling, how something that was once neutral becomes charged with emotion after a single experience. And what has changed is not the object itself, but the imprint that has been placed upon it through your consciousness, an imprint that remains accessible every time you encounter it again. But this does not stop at memory or association, because the same mechanism that allows past impressions to remain also allows new impressions to be formed. And when you begin to understand this, you realize that you are not only experiencing a world that has already been defined, you are participating in the ongoing definition of it, shaping how your environment responds to you, how situations unfold, how interactions take place, through the state you consistently bring into them. Consider how differently a conversation unfolds when you enter it with tension compared to when you enter it with ease. How the same words can lead to conflict or connection depending on the emotional tone you carry. How people respond to you not only based on what you say, but on what you are expressing beneath the surface. And that expression is not separate from the outcome. It is part of the cause, part of the imprint you are placing into the interaction as it happens. This is why you cannot separate your inner state from your external experience, because they are not independent processes. They are intertwined in ways that are easy to overlook, but impossible to escape. And once you begin to see this, you understand that every moment is an opportunity to imprint something new, not by forcing change, but by becoming aware of what you are already bringing into the situation before it fully unfolds. You may have thought that change requires altering external conditions first, that you need to fix what is outside of you in order to feel differently. But what you begin to notice is that the direction of influence can move the other way, that by shifting your state, even slightly, you begin to change how situations respond, how people engage, how outcomes develop, not because you are controlling them, but because you are interacting with them from a different foundation, and that foundation carries through the entire experience. This does not mean that every object will transform instantly, or that every situation will bend immediately to your inner state, but it does mean that nothing you experience is untouched by it, that every interaction carries some level of imprint, and over time, those imprints accumulate, creating patterns that feel consistent, environments that reflect certain qualities, experiences that align with the state you have been holding most often. At first, this may seem subtle, almost insignificant, because you are used to looking for dramatic changes, clear evidence, immediate results. But if you remain with it, if you begin to notice how your presence affects your experience, even in small ways, how your state influences the tone of a moment, how your attention shapes what becomes prominent in your perception. You begin to see that this is not a minor detail. It is a fundamental aspect of how your reality is formed. And once you see that, you are no longer interacting with a fixed world. You are engaging with something that is responsive, something that reflects and absorbs the state you bring into it, something that is not separate from your consciousness but continuously shaped by it. And that realization changes how you move, how you speak, how you think, because you understand that nothing you do is neutral. Every moment carries an imprint. Every interaction leaves a trace. And over time, those traces become the very fabric of the life you experience. Walk into a place where something is growing. It could be a garden, a quiet patch of trees, even a single plant by the window. And if you slow down enough to notice without immediately labeling or analyzing, you begin to feel something that is difficult to explain in ordinary terms. A kind of silent responsiveness, as if what is alive there is not just existing, but listening in a way that does not depend on sound. And the more present you are, the more unmistakable that feeling becomes. Not because anything has visibly changed, but because your awareness has become sensitive to something that has always been happening beneath the surface. You have been taught to think of growth as a mechanical process, something driven by biology, chemistry, sunlight, to water. And while all of that is undeniably part of it, there is another layer you have likely experienced without fully acknowledging. The way living systems seem to respond to care, to attention, to the quality of presence that surrounds them. How a plant that is tended to with genuine attentiveness often appears to thrive differently than one that is simply maintained out of obligation. And even if you have dismissed this as coincidence, there is a part of you that has noticed the pattern quietly repeating itself. This is not about assigning human characteristics to nature. It is about recognizing that life, in all its forms, operates within a field of interaction that is more subtle than physical contact alone. A field where vibration, not in the abstract sense of a word, but as the lived quality of your emotional and mental state, plays a role in how growth unfolds, how systems organize themselves, how potential moves into expression. You can feel this most clearly when you consider how different environments affect you, how certain places seem to energize you while others drain you, how being around certain people can lift your state or lower it without any obvious reason. And that experience is not isolated to you. It is part of a larger pattern of responsiveness that exists within living systems, a sensitivity to the state of what is interacting with them, a kind of resonance that influences how they develop over time. Think about how quickly your own state can shift in response to something subtle, a tone of voice, a glance, a memory, and how that shift then influences your body, your thoughts, your behavior, creating a chain reaction that alters your entire experience in a matter of moments. And if your own system is that responsive, it becomes easier to see that the systems around you, especially those that are alive, are not operating in isolation. They are part of the same field of interaction, responding in ways that may not always be visible but are nonetheless present. This is why growth is never purely external, never purely mechanical. It is always influenced by the environment in which it takes place. And that environment is not limited to physical conditions. It includes the emotional and mental atmosphere that surrounds it, the quality of attention, the consistency of presence, the underlying state that is being expressed, whether consciously or unconsciously, in every moment of interaction. You may not have thought of yourself as part of that environment, but you are, constantly, in the way you think, the way you feel, the way you move through your surroundings. You are contributing to the field that influences what grows and how it grows, not in a way that overrides natural processes, but in a way that interacts with them, subtly shaping the conditions under which they unfold. Consider how different your own life feels when you are in a state of tension compared to when you are in a state of ease, how opportunities seem to contract or expand, how interactions become more difficult or more fluid. And that is not just your perception changing. It is the way your state is interacting with the systems around you, influencing how they respond, how they organize, how they move in relation to you. You might be tempted to reduce this to mood or mindset, but it goes deeper than that, because what you are experiencing is not just an internal shift, It is a change in the vibration you are expressing, a change in the signal you are continuously emitting into your environment. And that signal does not remain contained within you. It interacts. It resonates. It influences the dynamics of what is around you in ways that are often too subtle to measure directly, but too consistent to ignore once you begin to pay attention. This does not mean that you are responsible for every outcome or that you can control every aspect of growth around you. But it does mean that you are not separate from it, that your state is part of the equation, part of the environment in which things develop. And once you recognize that, you begin to see that change does not always require direct intervention. Sometimes it begins with a shift in the quality of presence you bring into a situation, a shift in the vibration that you carry consistently over time. You may begin to notice that when you are aligned, when your state is steady, when your attention is clear and grounded, things seem to organize more easily. Growth appears more natural. Resistance feels reduced. And while it may not happen instantly or in every situation, there is a pattern that becomes visible, a responsiveness that reflects the state you are holding, not perfectly, not mechanically, but in a way that suggests a deeper connection between what is within you and what is unfolding around you. And if you stay with that observation, if you allow it to deepen rather than dismiss it, you begin to understand that growth is not something that happens only through external conditions. It is something that emerges from interaction, from resonance, from the alignment between what is alive within you and what is alive around you. And that realization changes how you approach everything, because you are no longer trying to force growth from the outside. You are participating in it from within, influencing it not through control, but through the quality of the state you consistently embody. Hold something in your hands for a little longer than usual, not to examine it, not to analyze it, but to notice how quickly a feeling begins to attach itself to what you are holding, how an object that was once neutral starts to carry a tone, a quiet emotional color that seems to belong to it, even though nothing about its physical structure has changed. And if you stay with that long enough, you begin to sense that what you are experiencing is not imagination, in the dismissive sense you were taught. It is the trace of something that has been impressed into that object through interaction, through attention, through feeling. You have already experienced this countless times, even if you have never stopped to question it. The way a place can feel heavy or light without any visible difference. The way a room can hold tension long after a conflict has ended. The way certain objects seem to carry comfort, familiarity, or even discomfort, as if they remember something that is no longer happening. And while you may have explained this away as memory or association, there is a deeper layer to it, one that becomes clearer when you begin to notice that the feeling is not only inside you, it appears to be embedded in what you are interacting with. Think about something you own that has meaning to you, something you would not easily replace even if you could find an identical version, and ask yourself why. Because if it were only about function or appearance, any similar object would suffice. Yet you know it would not feel the same, because what you are attached to is not just the object. It is the accumulation of experiences, emotions, and attention that have been impressed into it over time, creating a kind of energetic signature that you recognize without needing to explain. This is not limited to special or sentimental items. It is happening continuously with everything you interact with. Every time you focus your attention, every time you experience an emotion in connection with something, you are leaving an imprint, not in a way that alters the physical structure dramatically, but in a way that affects how that object or space is experienced, both by you and sometimes by others who are sensitive enough to perceive it. You may have walked into a place and immediately felt at ease without knowing why, or felt discomfort in a setting that appeared perfectly normal, and those experiences are not random. They are reflections of the emotional imprints that have accumulated in that environment. Layers of interaction that have shaped the way it is perceived, even if nothing about it has visibly changed. Now bring this back to yourself, because what you are noticing in objects and spaces is also present in your own life in a more direct way. The emotions you repeatedly carry do not simply pass through you and disappear. They leave traces. They shape your perception. They influence how you interpret situations. And over time, they begin to define the tone of your experiences, creating patterns that feel consistent even when circumstances vary. If you consistently approach situations with tension, that tension does not remain isolated within you. It influences how others respond, how interactions unfold, how opportunities present themselves. And gradually, it becomes part of the environment you experience. Not because the world has changed independently, but because your emotional imprint has shaped how you engage with it and how it reflects back to you. In the same way, when you carry a state of ease, appreciation, or quiet confidence, that state does not stay contained within your mind. It expresses itself in subtle ways, in your tone, your presence, your reactions, and those expressions influence the interactions you have, the responses you receive, the opportunities that appear, creating a different pattern that feels just as real, just as consistent, but is rooted in a different internal imprint. This is why emotional states are not insignificant. They are not just temporary experiences that come and go without consequence. They are part of the process by which your reality is shaped, not in isolation, but in interaction with everything around you. And once you begin to see that, you understand that what you feel repeatedly becomes part of the environment you live in, not just internally, but externally through the way it influences your experience. You do not need to control every emotion or eliminate every negative feeling. That is not the point. The point is to become aware of what you are consistently imprinting, what emotional patterns you are reinforcing, what states you are returning to again and again, because those are the ones that begin to define the tone of your life over time. You may notice that certain environments feel different to you as you change internally, that places you once found comfortable no longer resonate in the same way, that objects you were once attached to lose their significance. And that is not because they have changed. It is because the imprint you carry has shifted, altering how you experience them and what they reflect back to you. And if that is true, if your emotional state can change how you experience the same object, the same place, the same situation, then it follows that by shifting what you consistently carry within you, you begin to change the way your entire environment is experienced, not by replacing everything around you, but by altering the imprint you bring into every interaction. So, instead of focusing only on what is happening externally, begin to notice what you are imprinting into your experience through your emotions, not in isolated moments, but consistently over time, because that is where the pattern is formed. That is where the tone of your life is established. And once you see that clearly, you are no longer simply reacting to the world as it appears. You are participating in the ongoing shaping of it through the states you choose to embody again and again. Look at your life not through what is missing, not through what has not arrived yet, but through what is already here. And notice how unfamiliar that perspective may feel at first. Not because there is nothing to see, but because your attention has been trained to search for gaps, for problems, for the next thing that needs to be fixed or achieved. And in that constant movement toward what is not yet, you have quietly overlooked what is present, not just physically, but experientially. The subtle forms of support, opportunity, connection, and possibility that exist around you but remain unseen when your focus is anchored in lack. You have been taught that gratitude is something you practice after receiving, something you express in response to a positive outcome. But if you look more carefully, you begin to see that gratitude is not simply a reaction. It is a way of perceiving, a shift in how you relate to what is already in your experience. And when that shift occurs, even slightly, it begins to reveal aspects of your life that were always there but were not visible to you because your attention was directed elsewhere. Think about how differently the same situation can feel depending on where your attention rests. How a moment that could be experienced as insufficient can also be experienced as complete when viewed from a different angle. Not because the external details have changed, but because your relationship to them has shifted. And that shift does not require new circumstances. It requires a different orientation of awareness, one that is willing to recognize value without waiting for perfection. This is where gratitude begins to move beyond a simple practice and becomes a kind of gateway. Not because it brings something new into your life in a direct, mechanical way, but because it allows you to perceive what has been overlooked, to access layers of your experience that were previously hidden by the assumption that something was missing. And as those layers become visible, your sense of what is available to you begins to expand. You may have noticed that when you feel genuinely appreciative, even for something small, your state changes, not dramatically, but in a quiet, stabilizing way. As if your attention settles, your mind becomes less scattered, your body less tense. And in that state, you are no longer pushing against your experience. You are engaging with it more openly. And that openness creates space for things to move, to unfold, to connect in ways that feel less constrained. This is not about forcing yourself to feel grateful or pretending that everything is perfect. It is about allowing yourself to recognize what is already working, what is already present, what is already supporting you, even if it does not match the image of what you think you need. And when you begin to do that consistently, you start to notice that your experience of abundance shifts, not because you suddenly have more in a measurable sense, but because you are no longer filtering your reality through the lens of absence. Abundance, as you experience it, is not only determined by quantity, it is shaped by perception, by what you are able to recognize and receive. And if your attention is fixed on what is lacking, even significant resources can feel insufficient. While if your attention is open to what is present, even small elements can feel meaningful, connected, part of something larger that is unfolding in your favor. You might still be waiting for a moment when everything aligns before allowing yourself to feel satisfied. But that moment rarely arrives in the way you expect, because the state of appreciation is not the result of having everything. It is the condition that allows you to experience what you have as enough. And from that state, your relationship to desire changes. It becomes less about filling a void and more about expanding what is already working. Notice how different your actions feel when they come from a sense of lack compared to when they come from a sense of appreciation. How urgency and pressure begin to fade. How your decisions become clearer, less reactive, more aligned. And that shift in how you act influences what unfolds. Not because you are trying to control outcomes, but because you are no longer operating from a state that contradicts what you want to experience. You are not denying the existence of challenges or unmet desires. You are changing the way you relate to them. You are no longer defining your entire experience by what is not yet resolved. You are allowing multiple layers to exist at once. The recognition of what is present alongside the awareness of what is still unfolding. And that balance creates a stability that is often missing when your focus is entirely on what is absent. As you remain in that state, even imperfectly, you begin to notice that opportunities appear differently, that connections form more naturally, that solutions emerge in ways that feel less forced. And while it may be tempting to attribute this to external factors, there is a deeper pattern at work. Your perception has shifted, and with it, the way you engage with your environment has changed, creating conditions that support different outcomes. You do not need to chase abundance as something separate from you, something that exists only in the future or in the possession of others. You begin to see that it is already present in forms you had not recognized. And as your awareness expands to include those forms, your experience of life becomes less constrained, less defined by limitation, and more open to possibility. So instead of waiting for something to happen before allowing yourself to feel grateful, begin with what is already here. Not as a forced exercise, but as a genuine exploration of what you may have overlooked. And as you do that, you will find that gratitude is not simply a response. It is an opening, a shift in perception that reveals a different layer of reality, one where abundance is not something you acquire, but something you begin to notice, receive, and naturally expand into as your awareness changes. Before anything takes shape in your life, before an event becomes visible, before a situation feels real enough to touch, something has already been arranged within you, not in the form of a finished result, but as a structure, a pattern, a quiet design that determines how reality will eventually assemble itself around you. And what makes this so easy to overlook is that you rarely experience that design directly. You only encounter its outcome, the constructed version that appears outside of you and convinces you it began there. You have been taught to see reality as something solid, something already built that you must navigate, adjust to, or overcome. But if you pause and look more closely at how things actually unfold in your own experience, you begin to notice that what you encounter is not random, it is not disconnected. It follows a kind of internal logic, a consistency that reflects something deeper than external conditions alone. And that consistency points back to the mind, not as a passive observer, but as the place where the initial blueprint is formed. Think about how a building is created, how nothing appears physically until there is a design, a plan, a structure that exists before construction begins. And while the physical process may involve materials, tools, labor, and time, none of it happens without that initial blueprint. And in the same way, your experiences do not emerge from nothing. They are built upon patterns that already exist within your mind. Patterns of thought, belief, expectation, and identity that function as the design from which your reality is constructed. You might not consciously draw this blueprint. You may not sit down and decide every detail of what will happen, but that does not mean it is absent. It means it is operating beneath your awareness, guiding the construction process without announcing itself, shaping how events come together, how people interact with you, how opportunities appear or disappear, all in ways that feel natural because they align with the structure that has already been established internally. This is why certain patterns in your life feel so consistent, why similar situations arise in different forms, why outcomes seem to follow a familiar rhythm even when circumstances change. Because the blueprint has not changed. The underlying design remains the same. And as long as that design is intact, the construction process continues to produce results that match it. Not exactly, not in identical detail, but in essence. In tone. In pattern, you may try to change the outcome directly, to alter what is visible, to adjust the external structure. But if the blueprint remains unchanged, the system reorganizes itself. It finds a way to return to the original design, because the visible structure is not the source. It is the expression, and until the source shifts, the expression continues to reflect what is already in place. Let me bring this closer to your experience, because this is not abstract. This is happening every day in ways that are so familiar you rarely question them. The way you anticipate certain reactions from others, the way you interpret neutral situations as positive or negative, the way you approach opportunities with openness or hesitation. All of these are not isolated behaviors. They are extensions of a deeper structure, a blueprint that informs how you see and engage with the world. And because this blueprint operates quietly, because it feels like part of who you are rather than something you have adopted, it becomes easy to mistake it for reality itself, to assume that what you are experiencing is simply how things are, rather than recognizing that it is how things are being constructed through the patterns you are holding within you. This does not mean that external factors have no influence. It means that their impact is filtered through the design you carry, that the same condition can lead to different outcomes depending on the structure it is interacting with. Just as the same materials can be used to build entirely different structures depending on the blueprint that guides their arrangement, you may begin to notice that when you shift your internal state, even slightly, when you adopt a different assumption, a different sense of what is possible, the way situations unfold begins to change. Not instantly, not in a way that always feels dramatic, but in subtle adjustments, small shifts in how things come together. And those shifts are not random. They are the result of a blueprint that is beginning to reorganize itself. This is where patience becomes important, not as passive waiting, but as an understanding that construction follows design, that once the blueprint changes, the visible structure takes time to reflect it fully. And if you constantly look to the current structure for confirmation, you may miss the deeper process that is already underway, the gradual alignment between what is held within and what is appearing without. You are not separate from this process. You are not standing outside of it, trying to influence it from a distance. You are within it, continuously contributing to the design through your thoughts, your expectations, your sense of self, and whether you are aware of it or not. That contribution is shaping the construction of your experience, moment by moment. So, instead of focusing only on what you see, begin to pay attention to what you are holding within, the patterns you return to, the assumptions you reinforce, the identity you carry into each situation, because that is where the blueprint is formed. That is where the design takes shape. And once you begin to shift that, even in small ways, You are no longer reacting to a fixed reality. You are participating in the ongoing construction of it, not by forcing change from the outside, but by allowing a new design to emerge from within you and gradually take form in the world you experience. You have been looking for healing as if it were something outside of you, something that needs to be found, applied, received from the right source at the right time. And while there are moments when external support plays a role, there is a deeper layer to healing that does not begin where you have been taught to search. It begins in the quiet place where you decide what is true about you, not logically, not verbally, but as a felt assumption that settles beneath your awareness and starts shaping how your entire system responds. Think about how quickly your body reacts to what your mind accepts as real, how a single thought can create tension, how a memory can bring back physical sensations, how anticipation alone can alter your state without anything actually happening. And if your system can respond so strongly to what is imagined or remembered, it becomes clear that healing is not limited to physical intervention. It is also influenced by what you assume to be true about your condition, your potential, your ability to return to balance. You may have been conditioned to believe that healing takes time, that it depends on external validation, that it requires a process you must follow step by step. And while those ideas can feel safe, they can also become constraints, quiet assumptions that limit what you allow yourself to experience. Because if you have already accepted that something must take a certain amount of time or effort, your system begins to align with that expectation, reinforcing the very pattern you are trying to move beyond. This is where assumption becomes more than a belief. It becomes a form of authority, the quiet decision that defines how you relate to your current state. And when that assumption shifts, even slightly, something begins to reorganize within you, not because you have forced a change, but because you have removed a limitation that was being unconsciously maintained. You have felt moments when something changed quickly, when a shift occurred that did not follow the expected timeline, when relief appeared in a way that felt almost immediate. And instead of questioning those moments as anomalies, consider that they reveal something fundamental, that your system is capable of responding rapidly when the internal resistance is removed, when the assumption supporting the old pattern is no longer held in place. Healing, in this sense, is not something you create from scratch. It is something you allow by aligning with a state that already exists as a possibility within you, a state of balance, of wholeness, of coherence that your system naturally recognizes when it is not being contradicted by persistent assumptions of limitation or struggle. This does not mean you ignore what you are experiencing or deny what feels real. It means you begin to see that what feels real is not fixed. It is influenced by the way you are relating to it internally, and that relationship can change, not through force, but through a shift in what you accept as true about yourself. You may notice that when you feel empowered, when you sense a degree of control or influence over your state, your experience begins to change. Your body responds differently. Your thoughts become less reactive. Your overall system feels more stable. And that shift is not coming from an external intervention. It is coming from the way you are positioning yourself in relation to your experience, from the authority you are either claiming or giving away. Inner authority is not about controlling everything or forcing outcomes. It is about recognizing that you are not separate from the process, that you are not merely observing what happens to you, but participating in how it unfolds through the assumptions you carry. And once you begin to take that seriously, even in a small way, your relationship to healing changes. It becomes less about waiting and more about aligning. You may still feel doubt. You may question whether a simple shift in assumption can influence something that feels so tangible, so established. And that doubt is not something you need to fight. It is simply another pattern that has been reinforced over time. Another assumption that has been accepted without being fully examined. And as you begin to introduce a different assumption, one that supports healing rather than limitation, that doubt gradually loses its intensity, not because you eliminate it, but because you stop feeding it with your attention. What you are doing is not pretending that everything is already perfect. You are choosing to align with a version of yourself that is not defined by the current state, a version that already holds the possibility of balance, of restoration, of coherence. And as you remain with that, as you allow it to feel more natural, More familiar? Your system begins to respond. Not all at once, not always in ways you expect, but in a gradual reorganization that reflects the shift you have made internally. You may notice subtle changes first. Small improvements. Moments of ease where there was tension. Clarity where there was confusion. And it is important that you recognize these not as isolated events, but as signs of a deeper process. Indications that your assumption is beginning to take hold, that your system is responding to a new internal directive. Healing does not always look dramatic. It often unfolds quietly, in ways that are easy to overlook if you are only searching for major changes. And this is why your attention matters, because what you notice reinforces what you accept as true. And if you begin to notice even the smallest signs of alignment, you strengthen the assumption that supports them, allowing that pattern to expand. So instead of asking when you will be healed, begin to notice how you are relating to your current state, what assumptions you are holding about it, what authority you are giving to it, and gently, without force, begin to introduce a different perspective, one that does not deny what is, but does not define you by it either. And as you do that, you may begin to experience something that feels less like effort and more like a quiet return, a gradual movement toward a state that was never truly lost, only obscured by the assumptions you had learned to hold. Money has never been as solid as you were taught to believe. And if you pause long enough to look beyond the numbers, beyond the transactions, beyond the surface appearance of exchange, you begin to notice something that feels almost unsettling at first. Because what you call money does not carry meaning on its own. It carries meaning because of the value you and others collectively assign to it. And that value is not fixed. It shifts depending on perception, expectation, belief, and the quiet assumptions you hold about what is possible for you. You have been conditioned to see money as something external, something you must acquire, something that exists independently of your internal state. And while it certainly appears that way in the physical world, your experience of money, the way it flows into your life, the way it stays or disappears, the way it expands or contracts, is not determined solely by external conditions. It is deeply influenced by the relationship you have formed with it in your own mind. Think about how differently money feels to different people, how the same amount can represent security for one person and scarcity for another, how one person can feel abundance with less, while another feels lack with more. And that difference is not in the money itself. It is in the perception of value, in the internal framework that defines what is enough, what is possible, what is expected. And once that framework is established, it begins to shape how money is experienced and how it moves through your life. You may believe that increasing your income will automatically change your sense of abundance, but if the underlying perception remains the same, if the internal threshold of enough does not shift, you may find that the feeling of lack persists, not because you do not have more, but because your awareness is still anchored in what is missing rather than what is present. And as long as that pattern continues, your experience of prosperity remains limited regardless of the external increase. This is where value becomes more important than quantity, because money responds not only to effort or opportunity, but to how you perceive and interact with value itself, the way you recognize it, the way you receive it, the way you allow it to exist in your life without resistance or fear. And when your perception of value expands, your ability to experience prosperity expands with it. You can see this in how you respond to opportunities, how quickly you dismiss something as too small, too uncertain, or not worth your time, how you hesitate to receive, how you question whether you deserve more. And all of these responses are not about money directly. They are about the internal structure that defines what you allow into your experience. And that structure can either support expansion or quietly restrict it without you realizing it. Prosperity is not activated by chasing money alone. It is activated by aligning with a state that recognizes value in a broader sense, a state that is open to receiving, that does not immediately filter out possibilities based on past limitations, that does not shrink opportunities down to fit old expectations. And when you begin to operate from that state, your interaction with money changes, not because the system has changed, but because your participation in it has shifted. You may notice that when you feel constrained, when your attention is focused on what is lacking, Your decisions become more cautious, your actions more restricted, your willingness to explore new possibilities reduced, and that contraction influences the flow of money in your life, not in a direct, mechanical way, but through the way it shapes your behavior and perception, gradually reinforcing the pattern you are already experiencing. In contrast, when you feel a sense of openness, when you are less focused on limitation and more attuned to possibility, your actions begin to reflect that state. You become more receptive, more willing to engage, more aware of opportunities that were previously overlooked. And that shift creates conditions where money can move differently, not because you are forcing it, but because you are no longer operating from a state that restricts it. This does not mean ignoring practical considerations or acting without awareness. It means recognizing that your internal state is part of the equation, that how you perceive value influences how you engage with it, and that engagement shapes the outcomes you experience over time. You may still feel resistance when it comes to receiving. You may question whether you are ready for more, whether you can sustain it, whether it will last. And those thoughts are not obstacles to eliminate. They are indicators of the current structure you are operating within. And as you become aware of them, you have the opportunity to shift that structure, not by forcing yourself to believe something different, but by gradually allowing a new perspective to take hold, one that is not anchored in limitation. Consider how you define value in your own life, what you recognize as meaningful, what you allow yourself to receive without hesitation, what you expect as normal, because those definitions shape your experience of prosperity more than external factors alone. And as you expand that definition, as you begin to see value in places you may have overlooked, your sense of abundance begins to change, not as a concept, but as a lived experience. You are not separate from the flow of money. You are part of the system that defines how it is experienced. And when you begin to shift your relationship with value, with receiving, with expectation, you begin to activate a different pattern, one that supports expansion rather than contraction, one that allows prosperity to move more freely through your life, not because you have forced it to, but because you are no longer holding it back through the assumptions you have been carrying. So instead of asking how to get more, begin to notice how you are relating to what you already have, how you define value, how you respond to opportunities, because that is where the shift begins. Not in the external accumulation, but in the internal alignment that allows prosperity to be recognized, received, and sustained as a natural part of your experience, rather than something that feels distant or difficult to attain. Look carefully at what you call the world, not as something out there moving on its own, but as something you are continuously interpreting, shaping, and organizing through your own awareness. Because what you see is never raw reality. It is always processed, filtered, and arranged according to the structure of your thoughts. And once you begin to notice this directly in your own experience, the idea of an entirely objective world starts to loosen, not because it disappears, but because you recognize how deeply your perception is involved in forming what you experience as real. You have been taught to trust what you see, to assume that your perception reflects what is actually there. But if you look more closely, you begin to see that perception does not simply receive information. It selects, emphasizes, interprets, and even fills in gaps, creating a version of reality that feels complete, even though it is built from fragments. And those fragments are chosen based on what your mind is already expecting to find. Think about how quickly you recognize patterns, how you anticipate behavior, how you assign meaning to situations before fully understanding them, and notice how often those interpretations align with what you already believe, how rarely you question the initial impression once it has formed, and how easily you overlook details that do not fit the narrative you have already constructed, not because they are not there, but because your attention is not directed toward them. This is where the reflective nature of the universe begins to reveal itself, not as something mystical, but as something deeply practical, because what you perceive is not only influenced by the world, it is influenced by your thoughts about the world, and those thoughts act like a lens, determining what becomes visible, what remains hidden, what is interpreted as opportunity, and what is dismissed as irrelevant. You may have experienced this in simple ways, noticing something for the first time and then suddenly seeing it everywhere, or shifting your focus toward a specific goal and finding that related opportunities begin to appear more frequently. And while it may seem as though the world has changed, what has actually changed is your perception. Your awareness has been tuned to a different frequency, allowing you to recognize patterns and possibilities that were always present but previously unnoticed. This is not about the world rearranging itself instantly in response to your thoughts. It is about your perception organizing itself in alignment with what you are holding in your mind. And that organization influences how you act, how you respond, how you engage with your environment, creating a feedback loop where your thoughts shape your perception. Your perception shapes your behavior, and your behavior influences your experience, reinforcing the original thought. You may still feel that external events are independent, that they happen regardless of your perception, and in many ways, they do. But your experience of those events is never independent of your thoughts. It is always shaped by how you interpret them, how you respond to them. And over time, those interpretations accumulate, creating a consistent pattern that feels like reality itself, even though it is deeply influenced by the lens through which you are viewing it. Consider how two people can experience the same situation in completely different ways. How one sees possibility where another sees limitation. How one interprets a challenge as an opportunity while another sees it as a setback. And that difference is not in the situation itself. It is in the perception of it, in the thoughts that shape how it is understood and what meaning is assigned to it. This is where you begin to see that your thoughts are not just reactions. They are part of the process that creates your experience. They guide your attention. They influence your interpretation. They determine how you engage with what is happening. And because of that, they play a significant role in shaping the reality you live in. Not by controlling events directly, but by influencing how those events are experienced and responded to. You may not be able to change every external condition immediately, but you can begin to notice how you are perceiving it, how your thoughts are shaping what you see. And as you become aware of that, you gain the ability to shift your perception, to adjust the lens through which you are viewing your experience. And that shift can open up possibilities that were previously hidden from you. This does not mean ignoring challenges or pretending that everything is positive. It means recognizing that your perception is not fixed, that it can change, and that change influences how you experience and respond to the world, creating different outcomes over time. As you become more aware of this process, you begin to see that the universe, as you experience it, is not something that simply happens to you. It is something that reflects back to you the structure of your own thoughts, the patterns you hold, the expectations you carry. And while this reflection is not always immediate or obvious, it is consistent enough that, once recognized, it cannot be easily dismissed. You start to notice that what you focus on tends to expand in your awareness, that what you expect begins to feel more real, that what you repeatedly think about starts to influence how you interpret your experiences, and gradually, the connection between your thoughts and your perception becomes clearer, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived reality. So instead of asking what the world is showing you, begin to ask what you are bringing into the way you see it. What thoughts are shaping your perception? What patterns are guiding your attention? Because once you see that clearly, you are no longer limited to a single interpretation. You gain the ability to shift how you experience your reality, not by changing everything outside of you, but by adjusting the way you perceive and engage with what is already there. You have been living inside a structure you rarely question, a structure that tells you what is possible, what takes time, what must follow a sequence, and what cannot be changed once it has begun. And because this structure feels consistent, because it appears to be confirmed by everything around you, you have accepted it as fixed, as something you must adapt to rather than something you can influence. And yet, if you look closely at your own experience, you will begin to notice that this structure is not as rigid as it seems, that there are moments when time feels different, when progress accelerates or slows, when outcomes appear sooner than expected or take longer without clear explanation. And those moments are not anomalies. They are glimpses into a deeper flexibility that you have not been taught to recognize. You have been told that time is constant, that it moves at the same rate, regardless of what you feel or think, and on a measurable level, that appears to be true. But your lived experience tells a different story, because time does not feel the same in every moment. It expands when you are waiting, contracts when you are fully engaged, disappears when you are immersed, and stretches when you are uncertain. And while this may seem like a simple psychological effect, it reveals something more important, that your relationship to time is not fixed. It is shaped by your state of consciousness. Think about how differently you move when you are certain compared to when you are doubtful, how quickly you act when you feel aligned, how slowly you hesitate when you are unsure. And notice how that difference influences not only your internal experience but the outcomes themselves. Because when you act from certainty, you reduce resistance. You make decisions more efficiently. You engage more directly. And that changes how events unfold, not by altering time itself, but by altering how you move through it. This is where willpower begins to take on a different meaning. Not as force, not as struggle, not as pushing against resistance, but as a steady alignment with a chosen direction, a refusal to be pulled back into conflicting states, a commitment to remain with a decision long enough for it to organize your actions and perceptions consistently. And when that alignment is present, something shifts, because you are no longer scattered across multiple possibilities. You are focused, directed, moving with clarity. You may have thought of willpower as something exhausting, something you must constantly exert. But true willpower is not about constant effort. It is about consistency of state, the ability to hold a direction internally even when external conditions have not yet caught up. And that consistency creates a kind of momentum, a flow that carries you forward without the same level of friction you experience when you are uncertain or divided. This is why some people seem to achieve in less time what others struggle with for years, not because they are outside the constraints of time, but because they are operating within a different relationship to it, one where their actions, thoughts, and expectations are aligned, reducing the delays that come from hesitation, doubt, and contradiction. And while it may appear from the outside as if they are moving faster, what is actually happening is that they are moving more directly, with fewer interruptions in their internal state. You can see this in your own life when you reflect on moments of flow, when things seem to happen naturally, when progress felt smooth, when time seemed to pass quickly yet produce meaningful results, and compare that to moments of resistance, where time felt slow, effort felt heavy, and progress seemed minimal despite your attempts. And the difference between those experiences is not only in the external conditions, it is in the state you were holding as you moved through them. Personal reality is not separate from this. It is shaped by the same dynamics, the same alignment or misalignment of your internal state. And when you begin to recognize that, you understand that you are not simply subject to time. You are interacting with it, influencing how it is experienced and how effectively you move within it through the quality of your focus, your certainty, your willingness to remain aligned with a chosen direction. This does not mean you can eliminate time or bypass every process, but it does mean that the way you experience time and the outcomes that unfold within it are not fixed. They are responsive to your state. And as you begin to stabilize that state, as you reduce internal contradiction, as you strengthen your alignment, you begin to notice that things move differently, that progress becomes more consistent, that delays are reduced not because time has changed, but because you have. You may still encounter moments of doubt, moments where your state shifts, where your focus wavers, and that is natural, because you are not operating in isolation. You are interacting with a dynamic environment, but what matters is not the absence of fluctuation. It is your ability to return to alignment, to re-establish your direction, to continue moving forward without becoming lost in temporary disruptions. What you are developing is not control over time, but a different way of moving within it, one that is less reactive, less dependent on external confirmation, more rooted in a steady internal direction. And as that becomes more natural, you begin to experience a kind of fluidity, a sense that time is no longer something you are chasing or fighting against, but something you are moving through with greater ease and effectiveness. So, instead of asking how long something will take, begin to notice how you are relating to it, how aligned you are with the outcome, how consistently you are holding the direction you have chosen, because that is where the shift begins, not in the clock, but in your state. And as that state stabilizes, your experience of time and the results that unfold within it begin to reflect that alignment, revealing a flexibility that was always present but rarely recognized. Stand still for a moment and notice how many directions your life could take from right here. Not in a vague, abstract sense, but as a real, immediate truth that exists beneath your awareness. Because every moment you are not standing on a single fixed line moving toward a single fixed outcome. You are standing at a point where multiple possibilities already exist, layered quietly around you, waiting not to be created, but to be selected through the way you focus, the way you interpret, the way you decide what is real enough to act upon. You have been taught to think of the future as something that unfolds step by step, something that becomes real only after time has passed. But if you look closely at how your experience actually forms, you begin to notice that outcomes do not emerge from nothing. They emerge from a field of possibilities that are already present. And what determines which of those possibilities becomes your reality is not only what happens externally, but where your attention settles and how consistently you hold it there. Think about how many potential paths exist in even the simplest situation. How a single conversation could lead to connection or conflict. How an opportunity could be taken or ignored. How a moment could be interpreted as chance or dismissed as irrelevant. And each of those directions is not created in the moment. It is already available as a possibility. And what you do internally determines which one you align with and eventually experience. This is where focus becomes more than concentration. It becomes selection. Because what you focus on is not just what you see more clearly. It is what you begin to move toward. What you begin to reinforce. What you gradually bring into form through repeated attention. And over time, that focus shapes your perception, your behavior, your decisions, creating a pathway that feels natural because it has been consistently chosen. Even if that choice was not fully conscious, you may believe that you are reacting to what is happening, that your choices are determined by circumstances. But if you observe more carefully, you will begin to see that your focus often precedes your decisions, that you are drawn towards certain interpretations, certain possibilities, certain outcomes before anything is fully formed, and that draw is not random. It is influenced by your expectations, your beliefs, your identity, the patterns you have been reinforcing over time. This is why two people can stand in the same situation and see entirely different possibilities. One recognizing an opportunity while the other sees a risk. One moving forward while the other hesitates. And the difference is not in the situation itself. It is in the focus they bring into it, the way their attention selects certain aspects of reality and amplifies them while leaving others in the background. You have experienced this in your own life. Moments when you became aware of something and suddenly it appeared everywhere, not because it was newly created, but because your focus had shifted, allowing you to perceive it more clearly. And that same principle applies to the possibilities available to you. They are not all equally visible at all times. They become visible as your focus aligns with them. This is where responsibility begins to shift, not as a burden, but as a realization, because you are not only responding to reality, you are participating in the selection of it. And while you may not control every variable, you influence which possibilities gain strength in your experience through the direction of your attention, through what you repeatedly acknowledge as real, through what you allow yourself to consider as possible. You may still feel uncertainty. You may question whether focusing on a different possibility is enough to change your experience. And that hesitation is natural, because you have been conditioned to rely on external confirmation before committing internally. But if you wait for reality to prove itself before you align with a possibility, you remain anchored to what already exists, unable to shift into a different path because your focus has not moved. The shift begins when you allow yourself to hold a possibility without immediate proof, not as blind belief, but as a deliberate direction of attention, a willingness to explore what could be rather than what has been. And as you remain with that focus, as you return to it consistently, it begins to stabilize. It begins to feel less like a distant option and more like a natural direction. And from that point, your perception and behavior begin to align with it. You might notice that new ideas emerge, that your actions change subtly, that you respond differently to situations that once felt fixed. And these changes are not forced. They are the result of a shift in focus that is gradually selecting a different outcome, guiding you along a path that was always available but previously unnoticed or unchosen. This does not require constant effort or intense concentration. It requires consistency, a willingness to return to the same direction even when distractions appear. Even when old patterns try to pull your attention back, because every time you return, you strengthen that pathway. You reinforce that selection, allowing it to become more dominant in your experience. Over time, what once felt like a possibility begins to feel like reality, not because it suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but because your focus has aligned with it long enough for it to take form. And when that happens, it can feel as though circumstances have changed independently. But you begin to recognize that the shift started earlier, in the quiet moment when you chose where to place your attention. So, instead of asking what will happen next, begin to notice where your focus already is, what possibilities you are reinforcing without realizing it, what outcomes you are unconsciously selecting through your attention. Because once you see that clearly, you gain the ability to shift, to choose differently, to align with a path that reflects what you truly want to experience rather than what you have been repeating. And that is where your influence lies, not in controlling every detail, but in directing your focus toward the possibilities you are ready to bring into your reality. Decide, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, what you intend for your life, not as a distant wish, not as something you hope might happen if everything aligns, but as a direction you are willing to hold even when nothing around you has changed yet. And notice how that decision feels different from casual desire, because intention carries a different weight. It settles deeper. It organizes your attention. It begins to shape how you move before any visible result appears. And from that moment, something subtle begins to unfold. Something that does not look like control or force, but like a quiet coordination between your inner state and the world you are moving through. You may have experienced moments when things seemed to line up in unexpected ways, when the right person appeared at the right time, when an opportunity emerged just as you were ready for it, when a conversation led to something you could not have planned. And you may have called these moments coincidence, luck, timing. But if you look more carefully, you begin to notice that they often follow a period of clarity, a moment when you were aligned with a specific intention, when your focus was steady, when your state was not divided by doubt or hesitation. Synchronicity is not something that happens randomly. It is not a series of unrelated events accidentally forming a pattern. It is the visible expression of alignment, the way the external world begins to reflect the coherence of your internal state, not in a way that removes all challenge or uncertainty, but in a way that creates connections, pathways, and interactions that feel meaningful, as if they are part of a larger unfolding rather than isolated occurrences. You do not create synchronicity by forcing outcomes. You allow it by stabilizing your intention, by remaining with a direction long enough for your perception and behavior to align with it. And as that alignment deepens, you begin to notice more connections, more relevant opportunities, more interactions that support your movement, not because they were not there before, but because your awareness has become attuned to them. This is where emotional transmission begins to play a role that you may not have fully recognized, because your intention is not carried only by your thoughts. It is expressed through your emotional state, through the way you feel about what you are moving toward. And that feeling is not contained within you. It is communicated continuously, subtly, through your tone, your presence, your actions, influencing how others respond to you and how situations unfold. Think about how easily you can sense the state of another person without them saying anything directly. How you can feel confidence, hesitation, openness, or resistance in the way they carry themselves. And in the same way, others are sensing you, responding not only to what you say, but to what you are expressing beneath the surface. And that expression becomes part of the dynamic that shapes your interactions. When your intention is clear but your emotional state is conflicted, when you say you want something but feel uncertain or resistant, that contradiction is also communicated, not consciously, but through subtle signals that influence how situations respond to you. And this is why clarity of intention alone is not always enough. It must be supported by a state that aligns with it, a feeling that does not undermine what you are directing your life toward. You do not need to eliminate every doubt or achieve perfect emotional alignment, but you do need to become aware of what you are consistently transmitting, what state you are returning to most often, because that is what shapes the pattern of your interactions over time. That is what influences the kind of responses and opportunities that appear in your experience. There is a moment, and you may have felt it before, when everything feels aligned, when your intention is clear, your emotional state is steady, and your actions flow naturally without overthinking. And in that state, things seem to happen differently, not because you are controlling them, but because you are no longer creating internal resistance. You are moving in a way that allows the external world to respond more fluidly. This is where synchronicity becomes more visible, not as something you are trying to create, but as something you begin to notice more often, because your state is no longer fragmented. Your attention is directed. Your emotional transmission is coherent, and that coherence creates conditions where connections can form more easily, where pathways can open without being forced. You may still encounter moments that do not align immediately, situations that seem unrelated or even contradictory. But when your intention is stable, when your state remains consistent, those moments often become part of a larger pattern, revealing their relevance over time in ways that were not obvious at first. And this is why patience is not passive. It is the ability to remain aligned without needing constant confirmation. What you are doing is not manipulating events directly. You are aligning yourself with a direction and allowing your state to guide how you move within it. And as you do that, you begin to experience a different quality of interaction with the world, one where things feel less random, less disconnected, more responsive to the state you are holding. So instead of asking how to control outcomes, begin to notice how you are holding your intention, how you are feeling about it, what you are transmitting consistently through your presence, because that is where the process begins, not in the visible result, but in the alignment between what you choose, what you feel, and how you move. And as that alignment stabilizes, the connections you once called coincidence begin to reveal themselves as something else entirely, a reflection of the coherence you have established within. You can understand everything you have heard so far. You can see the patterns, recognize the connections, even agree with the logic of it. But none of that changes your life until something more fundamental happens, something quieter and far more decisive. The moment you stop observing these ideas from a distance and begin to live from within them, not as concepts you visit occasionally, but as a state you inhabit consistently, because transformation does not come from knowing. It comes from becoming. Up to this point, you may have still felt like someone trying to apply a method, someone experimenting with thoughts, with beliefs, with perception, hoping to influence outcomes. But there is a shift that moves beyond all of that, a shift where you are no longer trying to change your reality as something separate from you. You begin to recognize that you are the source from which it is being expressed. And from that recognition, your approach changes, not through effort, but through identity. You have been carrying an identity that was built over time, shaped by past experiences, reinforced by repetition, accepted as truth simply because it has felt consistent. And that identity has been the lens through which everything else has been interpreted, the foundation from which your thoughts, expectations, and reactions have emerged. But what you may not have fully seen is that this identity is not fixed. It is not something you are required to maintain. It is something you have been embodying, and anything that is embodied can be replaced. There is a difference between thinking differently and being different, and you have likely experienced the gap between the two. Moments when you tried to adopt a new perspective, but still felt pulled back into familiar patterns. And that is because identity is not changed through surface-level adjustments. It shifts when you begin to consistently embody a new state, when your thoughts, emotions, and actions align with a different sense of self long enough for it to feel natural. This is not about pretending. It is not about forcing yourself to act in ways that feel false. It is about allowing a new version of yourself to become familiar, to move from something that feels like an effort into something that feels like a default. and that transition does not happen instantly. It happens through repetition, through consistency, through the quiet decision to return to the same state again and again until it stabilizes. You may notice resistance at first, a sense that the new identity is not fully real yet, that it feels like something you are trying on rather than something you are. And that is part of the process, because the old identity has been reinforced for so long that it feels more stable, more certain. But stability does not equal truth. It simply reflects what has been practiced most consistently. As you continue, as you remain with the new state even when the old one tries to reassert itself, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in subtle ways. Your reactions change, your expectations adjust, your perception reorganizes, and gradually, the new identity begins to take root, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. This is where embodiment becomes important, because it is not enough to think differently in isolated moments. You must carry that state into your actions, your interactions, your decisions, allowing it to express itself naturally rather than keeping it confined to your internal dialogue. And as you do that, the boundary between who you were and who you are becoming begins to dissolve. You may begin to notice that situations respond differently, that people engage with you in new ways, that opportunities appear that align with this new state. And while it may be tempting to attribute this to external change, you begin to recognize that the shift started within you, that your identity has changed, and your reality is reflecting that change. Living as the creator does not mean controlling every detail or eliminating all uncertainty. It means understanding your role in the process, recognizing that your state is not separate from your experience, that what you embody internally is continuously being expressed externally. And from that understanding, you move differently, not with force, but with clarity. You are no longer waiting for conditions to change before you allow yourself to feel a certain way. You are no longer dependent on external validation to confirm your direction. You are choosing your state first, allowing your experience to align with it over time. And that choice becomes the foundation of how you live. There is a quiet confidence that emerges from this. Not loud, not aggressive, but steady. A sense that you are no longer reacting to reality as something fixed, but engaging with it as something responsive, something that reflects the identity you are embodying. And that confidence does not need constant reinforcement. It stabilizes as you continue to live from this place. You may still encounter challenges, moments that test your alignment, situations that pull your attention back toward old patterns. But what has changed is your awareness, your ability to recognize what is happening and return to the state you have chosen. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to maintain direction. This is where everything comes together, not as a final conclusion, but as a new way of being, where you are no longer separate from the process of creation, where your identity, your perception, your intention, your focus, all operate as parts of a unified system that shapes your experience continuously. And as you remain within that system, as you continue to embody the state you have chosen, you begin to see that the life you are living is not something happening to you. It is something being expressed through you, shaped by the identity you are now fully willing to become.